looking at this diagram, we see the classic diagram, Saussurean diagram that we have, and at the left we have our transformation, which is the object at the top and its appearance at the bottom in some way. So there's a transformation. The transformation is, according to Saussure, psychological. If we move to the diagram on the right, we see a stronger articulation of what Saussure said and the sound image, and then the way in which it is signified as this sound image signifier becomes signified as a concept, as a mental concept, and then this constitutes the sign, and hence the signification. Now, Saussure told us that this signification is an arbitrary one, meaning that it's somehow motivated so that it's not natural, that it can be anything, arbitrary. It doesn't have to be as it is. We can say the word cat and we get a mental image of a furry, hairy, whiskery, clawy, purry, a little thing with 4 legs that comes to us at 6 p.m. every day and rubs against our legs asking for food. However, we can also use the word gatto. We can also use the word katta. We can also use the word goyangi. We can also use the word neko, which is Japanese, neko. So there are many ways to signify this, and any of an infinite number of signifiers for this mental concept of a furry, purry, clawy, hungry, cute little 4-legged thing that we domesticate and we keep at home for companionship. If we move on to the next diagram, we see a very similar diagram, and we insert, rather than the neko, which is the Japanese word for cat, and kata, which is the Greek word for cat, and gato, which is the Spanish word for cat, we insert the word ox, which is a male version of the 4-legged animal that gives us beef and gives us milk. So if we say the word ox or x, there is an auditory representation there in that word, but the signification then becomes a 4-legged bull-horned male. In French, the word for ox is rather boeuf, which sounds a lot like the word beef. So then when we say the word ox, I automatically think of a 4-legged male version of a cow, which is used to pull certain carriages or something. When I think of a bull, I do not think of it pulling vehicles or carriages or carts, but when I think of an ox, I do. And then this becomes a mental representation of the word ox. So then, what did Benveniste tell us about Saussure? Well, first he introduced to us he expressed to us that Saussure saw this sign as arbitrary, and meaning that the sign is the signifier and the signified are a binary, and this binary is of the signifier and signified are definitely not natural. They are arbitrary. The nature of the sign, Benveniste told us, is arbitrary. It's motivated, yet not natural. Because we can connect a signifier to a signified in an infinite number of ways, possibly, said Saussure. And Benveniste told us that, look, this is what Saussure told us, and he questioned this. And he told us that Saussure, and which we know, Saussure develops that signs are purely differential. So they're not defined by their positive content. Remember, we spoke about positivity and negativity. Signs are not defined by their positive content, but by their negative content, what they are not. So we know Albania because it is not Greece. And we know Costa Rica because it is not Brazil. We know Canada because it is not the United States. We know Milan because Milan is not Pavia. So we look at the boundary and we say, well, this is this because it is not this. And Saussure told us that that's how we get the sign, by knowing what it is not. If we don't know what it is not, then we cannot know the sign. And this was, of course, very structuralist, and we'll speak about structuralism in time. So Benveniste tells us then, and I quote, that it is only if one thinks of the animal ox in its concrete and substantial particularity, says Benveniste, that one is justified in considering arbitrary the relationship between boeuf, which is the French word for ox, on the one hand, and ox, which is the English word for ox, on the other, to the same reality. The concrete and substantial particularity. This means that it is not changeable. And this was the important central part of Benveniste's argument, that if there is something that's concrete, substantial, unchangeable, because it doesn't have a changing form, it is what it is. There's no way we can change the ox. So the important thing then that Emile Benveniste described about this concrete and substantial object, which is the ox, is that no particular word associates naturally with a concrete and substantial object. No particular word. So it's true that we can take this four-legged male version of a cow which gives us milk, and we can call it an ox, we can call it boeuf, we can call it a bull, we can call it something else. But we do not have to call it anything. We can call it anything we like. Anything we like. Anything we like. Not anything I like. Remember, I say I use the collective pronoun we for a reason, with quite significant motive. We call this male version of a female cow an ox or a bull for certain reasons. However, we can choose anything as long as we know what we are talking about, to which we refer. So we need to have some sort of collective commonality, consensus. If two languages differ then in the use of words, there is no natural connection between the concrete and a very substantial object and the name that we give it. So obviously, if two languages differ, and who's to say that the Nigerian language is better than the Swahilian language? They're both completely functional, so there is no way we can suggest that the Nigerian language is better than the Swahili language, or the Swahili language is better than the Nigerian, or Sheng is better than Swahili, or anything else. Okay, so if both languages then have their own respective specific word for the ox, then we know that because no language is better than another and everything, then when we look at linguistic relativity, we'll discuss that too, then we see that the word for ox is not naturally connected in any way to the actual concrete version of the ox. Okay, so Benveniste then further describes his ideas of Saussure, and this is where we begin to deepen our conceptions of Benveniste's work on Saussure, as he tells us that, look, Saussure told us that language is a science of form. It is not this concrete and substantial thing that exists and does not change. It's not a rock that changes every 5 million years. It actually is something that becomes a form contingent on, respective to, certain other things. And these things change all the time, like the ocean and the waves come up and down, up and down, up and down. And I have had friends who, from a university in Hong Kong, I forget which one, the Polytechnic University of Hong Kong, and they've, in the School of Graphic Design, and they've gone to different parts of the world to do some very great work combining art and science. And at one point, they went to the South Pole. And if you go to the university's webpage, and you'll see they've done some great work. And they say that they took they rented a big ship, and one of those big ships, and they went from I think it was the Falkland Islands or the southern part of Argentina, and they went to the South Pole, and they experienced the huge waves. I think they said that the waves were 10, 15 stories in height. So if you think of a building, look out your window and look at a building that's 10, 15, even 20 stories in height, and you think that the ship goes up and down these in 3 or 4 seconds, it's very scary. And the ship goes frequently, if not always, vertically. So it tips vertically, and then in 2 or 3 seconds it's turned the other way, and everything's really got to be nailed down in the ship, otherwise everything goes everywhere. So it's very scary. And he did comment that the women were not afraid at all. It was the men who were really afraid. The women loved it, and they were looking out the window and smiling, and the men were crying, said my friend. Okay, at any rate, we continue. So Saussure tells us that language is a science of form. So it forms and reforms like waves in the ocean. It's not concrete, it is not substantial. So language is a science of forms. If that's the case, then all language must exclude all concrete and substantial objects. The objects that language references. Because if language is a science of forms, then the concrete and substantial objects that it references cannot be in language. They must be outside, said Saussure. So if there's something that we signify, then this signification has to be just a mental representation of this concrete and substantial object. But however, the question then is, does language actually reference these objects? If language references these objects, and the mental representation of these objects is actually a representation of these objects. When I say ox, I think of an ox, an ox, right? Not an ox with 5 legs, but an ox with 4 legs that has bull horns and pulls along this cart. I actually signify this representation of this actual substantial concrete thing. So then Benveniste tells us that there's a contradiction here, because if language actually excludes these, but we actually signify, when we say ox, this mental picture of this ox comes up, then we don't get a picture of a 5-legged ox or an ox with 2 heads or an ox that flies with wings. We get a picture of this ox with 4 legs with bull horns that is a male version of the female cow, which gives us milk. So hence, we draw a mental representation of this real thing, which is concrete and substantial. So there's a contradiction there. How can this real thing, which appears in our mind, be a form? To build onto this, then, Benveniste tells us that the sign only appears arbitrary to someone who limits himself to observing from the outside the bond established between an objective reality and human behavior, and condemns himself thus to seeing nothing but contingency. So if we stand on the outside, according to Benveniste, then we do not have an articulate, detailed observation of what's going on. And we say, well, there's got to be an arbitrary relationship. And this is basic social theory, isn't it? If we are standing in a certain community and we see a very distant community, then we do not see the articulations and subtleties in that community. We see just a blur. So if we're standing in Milan and we're looking at Pavia, we see a tiny little spot and nothing else. We say, well, there's got to be 1.2 people in Pavia, and that's all we know. And there's one building probably, and that's all we know, because we don't know anything about Pavia. But when we get closer to Pavia, we say, wow, Pavia is great. So we see lots and lots of people and nice stores and nice restaurants and some good-looking people and stuff, and there's more than 1.2 people. There's actually a few thousand and a few churches and everything. And we've spoken about Pavia because my best friend Paolo and his wife live in Pavia, and I think it's a very beautiful town, and if you ever get a chance, you go to Milan, then head on to Pavia. It's very pretty. So he tells us that, look, when we find a certain denominator in a sign, then we should not consider its absolute value. However, we must consider and according to Benveniste, the discerning of the inner structure of the phenomenon of which only the outward appearance is perceived. So we have to look at the inner structure and see how this works. If there is a sign, if we see a sign and there's a certain signification, and there's of course, a signifier and a signified, we should look at how this works and whether this is a binary or whether it is not, and why. So Benveniste then argues that the connection between the signifier and, in Saussure's argument, the sound image, and the signified, and the concept which is attached to the sound image, are in fact necessary. Now, what does he mean by necessary? What does the word necessary mean, and what does he mean by not being arbitrary? And at that point, we have to start to consider tensions between various things, and we will later in this talk look at the concepts of annonce and annonciation, and the signified being perforce identical in my consciousness with the sound sequence. So he tells us that, look, there's a necessary relationship between the signifier and the signified, and there is an identical emergence, identical form. So this is interesting, that if the concrete object, which is here, is concrete, the ox, and if the name which we give the ox is arbitrary, then how can the image of the ox, which is actually the ox, because it's an image of the ox, it cannot be something else, how can that be arbitrary with the signifier? So there's a contradiction. His argument was that the connection between the signifier and the signified is necessary. I'm going to now show you a diagram which represents this. And we have 4 parts to this. We have the pre-signifier, which is the mental representation of the ox. And we have the ox auditory representation, which is the word ox, the phonics ox. Then we have the ox, which is the mental representation, which emerges as we say the word ox. And then we have the post-signifier, or the mental representation of the ox. And then we have the post-signifier, which is the actual object, the ox. So Saussure is telling us that the relationship between the auditory representation and the post-signifier, for example, is arbitrary, and also the relationship between the pre-signifier and the mental representation is also arbitrary. However, if we look at the top, the thought is of the animal ox in its concrete and substantial particularity, as it is at the bottom. If we now move to the next diagram, we see a simplification of this, and we see that right in the middle, at the center, we have our signification process, the sign. This is a sign, and there is a process of signification, which suggests that there is a certain transformation, maybe possibly in this case from the auditory representation to a mental representation. If the relationship between the auditory and the mental representation is arbitrary, as Saussure says, then the relationship between the referent and the mental representation, the concrete and substantial version of the mental representation, which is the referent, is non-arbitrary. So there's a certain competition, a competing between the auditory and mental representations. We see that the left relationship is non-arbitrary, the right is arbitrary, so there is a contradiction, some sort of a contradiction. So if the relationship between the signifier and the signified is non-arbitrary and it is necessary, yet the relationship between the referent and the mental representation is arbitrary, then we have a problem according to Benveniste. So moving back to Saussure then, Saussure's notion of the relationship between the signifier and the signifieds, and the relationship according to Saussure was arbitrary. So then Saussure tells us that the words saw and bof are the signifiers. They are the phonetic clusters which, when said or when heard, produce a certain signified, a mental representation. And this becomes apparent in the fact that when we say the word bof and we say the word ox, we develop the same mental representation, a four-legged male version of the cow, which produces beef and milk and everything that we eat and consume. And so hence the relationship between the signifier and the signified becomes an arbitrary one. However, there is a difference between signifiers, but they still refer to the same reality. And this signified or this sign relationship is supposed to exclude the concrete version, the substantial version, as the signifier and signified are arbitrary and hence can always change. And this becomes, as Saussure says, a science of forms, yet the object must remain outside of the sign because it is not a form. However, the mental representation is exactly that. The mental representation is a mental representation of the concrete and very substantial object. So this presents a contradiction. How can we exclude the ox, the concrete and substantial form of the ox, when we have exactly that? So if language is a science of forms, then how can it be a science of forms when the signified is actually a very concrete thing, said Benveniste, and this becomes a contradiction. Saussure tells us that there is an arbitrary connection between the signifier and the signified. However, according to Benveniste, this is impossible, as the signifier always represents the signified and vice versa. There is a certain natural representation. If we are who we are, then every time we signify, we present or we hear, or we become exposed to a certain signifier, then we obtain a certain signified. And the analogy I use is that of two gases. If two gases mix, then they combine in a certain way. And this certain combination is always the same. However, if we have two substances which are not combinable, such as a gas and a solid, then this becomes arbitrary because the gas is coming and going and not permanent. But if we have two gases, then the two gases join in a permanent relationship. So the arbitrary connection is not possible between the signifier and the signified because they form to be compatible. There is a certain form on the behalf of each of the signifier and signified so that they develop a certain compatibility. And I again quote Benveniste as he tells us that it is only if one thinks of the animal ox in its concrete and substantial particularity that one is justified in considering arbitrary the relationship between bof on the one hand and ox on the other to the same reality. So in another way, then, Benveniste is telling us that the only arbitrariness is the connection of the words to the substantial and concrete version of the signified, of the mental representation. And if we connect the signifier and the signified mental representation, then this cannot be arbitrary, because these always form in a certain way to provide a continuously similar relationship in the mind. Now, this is within the individual, intrapersonally. If we look at this interpersonally, then it's a different story, and we will again discuss this in our discussion of annonce and annonciation. So he tells us then that Benveniste tells us that the arbitrariness, which Saussure argued is between the signifier and the signified, is not between the signifier and the signified. The arbitrariness between the signifier and the signified, the relationship, is not arbitrary, but actually necessary. This arbitrariness, however, rather emerges in the referent sign relationship. So between the sign and the referent, there is an arbitrariness, but between the signifier and the signified within the sign, there is not an arbitrary development, but a necessary development. And this is what he spoke about when he said that we cannot really get the sign by standing on the outside. We have to go inside and see what's happening. If we stand on the outside, then we think, okay, it's arbitrary and everything. If we're standing in Milan, we do not see what's happening in Pavia, so we have to really get to Pavia and see what's happening. And this is basic social theory as well. So this became a deconstruction of sorts of Saussure's argument, and the argument collapses as the distinction between the signified and the referent is blurred. So, so what's happening? Is it arbitrary? Is it not arbitrary? Then we have to move on from there and describe it in new ways, said Benveniste. And his blur was really predicated on the historical and relativist thought of the late 19th century, which he spent substantial time on, and maybe one day we will discuss this and see how that affects the mechanics of Benvenistean thought. Now, we will just touch on how this arbitrariness, non-arbitrariness continuum works, because if you think about that within the individual, the signifier is always the same for the signified, and the signified always presents itself as the same for the signifier, then we see that the connection is necessary, not arbitrary. But if we think about the ways in which within a society, across a society, we signify, then there's variation. So, for example, if I say sœur in French, or sister, or adelphi in Greek, then we see that the sister, the image of the sister, always changes, because everyone has a different sister, and we see our sister differently, and everything in another language, of course. However, within one person, our image does not change. The signifier-signified relationship is always very necessary. So, there is a universal contingency across society. But within the individual, intrapersonally, there is very little contingency. The contingency is very limited. And across society, then, it is not limited at all. It's quite extensive, and contingency is definitely there. And so this arbitrariness between the signifier and the signified really depends on whether we're speaking intrapersonally or interpersonally.